We are focusing on stories this month and how the stories or parables that Jesus told about the kingdom of heaven shape the way we think and act as kingdom citizens as we live out our own stories. I first want to take a minute to explain and talk about parables just a little bit. In case you're unfamiliar, a parable is a fictional story designed to teach a lesson. Now, they can be full of symbolism, like the parable of the seeds that were scattered, but the seeds are really the word of God. Or they could just be like a hypothetical situation that would help people understand a point better, like how the Good Samaritan teaches us who our neighbors are. The point of parables was to give people a story to latch onto that they were already kind of familiar with in order to help them understand a concept that might be new. And it's also important to know that Jesus was not the first to do this. This was a very common teaching practice of the rabbis of that day. In fact, they probably were the ones who taught Jesus how to teach this way. And not only did the Jewish rabbis use it, but also the pagan philosophers of that day used it as well. Even Aesop and his fables predate Jesus by about 600 years. And that's because stories are powerful. There is something embedded in our DNA that seeks to grab on to elements of the human experience lived out in others. And it helps us to learn and grow. So here's a quick example, okay? So World War II ended on September 2nd, 1945. That's a fact. You may know that date, you may not, but that's a fact. But that's not what I know about the day World War II ended. I know about that day from the stories my grandma has told me about how everyone in her tiny little Virginia town ran out of their houses when they heard the news. And they started marching up and down the streets of the town, banging pots and pans together and cheering. I can almost hear it. And it makes an event that happened 40 years before I was even born seem so real and so close to me. Stories are powerful. And so, as we look through our parable today, I want us to do something that will help us connect with our own story just a little bit. Now, I used to do a project with my middle school and high school students when we studied the parables. You see, Jesus used parables that talked about vineyards and farming and servants and masters because that's what first century life was like for these people. They were familiar with these concepts. If Jesus were here today, he would use totally different parables, and we would be able to relate to them in our 21st century daily life. So in my project, what I would always have the students do is pick a parable, analyze it, and then they had to figure out how to retell it to a modern audience. And then they would have to act it out. Now, don't worry. I'm not going to make you act out anything or upload any videos of you acting these things out. But here's what I'm going to have you do. I want you to think about the last time you had to do a group project. It could have been 20 years ago, could have been 2 days ago. Okay, got that image in your head? Got that feeling? Do you have a strong feeling about group projects? Yeah, let me tell you how I feel about them. I don't like them. And I especially don't like it when I don't get to pick who's on my team. It annoys me so much that there is always one person who seems to slack until the very last minute, throws their part together the night before, and they still get the same grade as everybody else. It's just not fair. Now, I wonder if any of you see it differently. Maybe you don't like group projects because no one ever looks at you to be on your team or to be on their team. You have to wait until everyone else has already found a team and then get assigned somewhere. I've been there too. It's not fun. Whatever your feelings are, I want you to take those feelings and I want you to hold on to them as we read this parable. So, I'm going to read Matthew 20, verses 1 through 16. And this is the story of the laborers in the vineyard. Here we go. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I'll pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around. And he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" And they said to him, "Because no one's hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now, when the first came, they thought they would receive more. But each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat?" But he replied to them, "Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first and the first will be last." Okay. Anyone getting group project vibes there? Anyone thinking, well, that's not fair. Why should the ones who slacked all day get the same wage as the ones who worked sun up till sundown? Fun fact, this parable is actually where that phrase, waiting till the 11th hour, came from. You're in good company. This is a tough parable. And it has been interpreted and misinterpreted for 2,000 years. When Jesus taught this parable, it was right after Jesus encountered the rich young ruler who went away sad rather than give up his riches for discipleship. Jesus originally told this parable to his disciples regarding his welcoming of the sinners and the lowly and the rejection of the rich and proud. When Matthew wrote it down in his gospel, he used it to help his Jewish audience understand why Gentiles or non-Jewish people were now allowed to be part of the faith. During the Reformation, the Protestants actually used this parable against the Catholics and their history and devotion to ritual. And I've heard it used to admonish the old guards of the church to accept the new folks, or the longtime Christians to accept the seekers. But every time, it has kind of that same group project vibe. We're all getting the same reward, so it doesn't matter how long you've been working at it. And if I'm being honest, that's always felt a little icky to me. No matter how I looked at it, that interpretation just didn't seem to sit right with me. And it didn't seem to match with the character of Jesus. But then I looked at verse 15. And verse 15 says, "Am I not allowed to do with what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous?" And then I still wasn't quite sure what to make of it. But then, I looked to the Greek, as one does. Here's the literal translation of the second part of that verse. It says this: Is your eye bad because I am good? This was a really clever turn of phrase that Jesus used, and something gets lost in the translation, but here's what it means. He's saying to these people, you feel resentment toward my goodness because you're looking at it wrong. I've been looking at it all wrong. I needed a new perspective. One that's not wrapped up in fairness and people carrying their weight, but something new. Something that we can hopefully build our own story upon. So let's put on some new glasses and look at this parable. So first, we have to stop comparing. This parable is not about comparing the new workers with the old workers, or the sinners with the saints, or the Jews and the Gentiles, the Catholics and the Protestants, whatever. Let's look at the workers in this parable, all of them together. These were day laborers. That means they didn't have the financial stability of being hired men. They would have had salaried work. They also didn't have the security of being slaves, which was very different from the chattel slavery of our history. In the first century, slavery was often temporary and voluntary, and it would offer protection to those owned by the landowner during their time of servitude. No, these workers didn't belong to a specific vineyard. They had no stable income, nowhere to belong. So every day they would show up to the marketplace and wait for a landowner to come and choose them and offer them work. If they didn't get chosen, well, they and their family went hungry that day. So we see these workers being hired in shifts all day long. They go to work in the field for an agreed upon wage, and then we get to the latecomers. Verses 6 through 7. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around. And he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" And they said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." Here's the first perspective shift here. Those 11th hour workers weren't lazy. They had been ready to work all day long. It's just no one had hired them. Now, these could have been the older, could have been the weaker, the disabled workers, the workers that no other landowner wanted or could find a use for. And the only reason they hadn't gone to work yet is because no one asked them. As soon as the master sent them to the field, they obeyed. But that's not what the early workers saw at the end of the day. They seemed to forget that they came from the same place. That at the beginning of the day, they didn't belong either. And it was the same master calling them to obediently work, just at different times. The grumbling that arose among the workers at the end of the day was rooted in two things: comparison and assumptions. Every one of us has a story of how we came to Jesus. We have all lived through different battles. We have all had to overcome different challenges when it comes to our relationship with God and the story of our life. My story doesn't look like yours. You have lived through stuff I don't know about. But no matter what your story looks like, it has value. And it belongs to you and is no better or worse than anyone you know. We cannot compare our stories with the stories of others. It accomplishes nothing to look at our brother and sister and think, "I seriously cannot believe they think that was hard. They have no idea." Or, "Man, those people in that video the other week have been through so much. I haven't experienced anything. My story is so lame." that also doesn't accomplish anything. But here are two things that are beneficial: curiosity and celebration. We have got to be more curious. Listen to the stories of others. Ask them questions about what they've been through and how it has shaped them. Allow their stories to encourage you and foster greater understanding and strengthen your own relationships. And celebrate this. Celebrate the fact that we have all been called to a community, a family, a kingdom that we once didn't belong to, and now we do. And our kingdom is full of diverse stories and backgrounds and lives, and that is beautiful. Let's take notice of something else in this story. Two things that seem like they should matter, but they don't. Work and reward. We go from the marketplace to the time of day where they settled their accounts. Jesus didn't think it was all that important to specify exactly what the first hour workers did versus what the 11th hour workers did. There are no tasks for us to compare, and there's also no reward for us to compare. They all got the same thing. And how much was that? It was a denarius, the amount that had been determined to supply the daily needs of a laborer and their family. And I think this is the part that's so hard for our modern ears to hear. We are so conditioned to believe that the harder you work, the greater the payoff. But that's not how the kingdom of Jesus works. It's not a meritocracy. Ephesians 2:7-10 in the Message says, "Now God has us where he wants us, with all the time in this world and the next to shower grace and kindness upon us in Christ Jesus. Saving is all his idea and all his work. All we do is trust him enough to let him do it. It's God's gift from start to finish. We don't play the major role. If we did, we'd probably go around bragging that we'd done the whole thing. No, we neither make nor save ourselves. God does both by doing the making and the saving. He creates each of us in Christ Jesus to join him in the work that he does, the good work he has gotten ready for us to do. Work we'd better be doing. There is nothing you can do to earn heaven. You can't work your way in. And we don't do good works with an eyes on the prize mentality. Have you ever heard someone who's just done something that no one else wants to do go, well, there's another jewel for my crown? Sorry, it doesn't work like that. And that's because the point in this story isn't the work they did or the reward they received. The point is when the landowner called them to the work, they obeyed. All of them, even the grumpy ones. God has prepared good works for us all to do. Not to earn a reward at the end of our life, but to join with Jesus in what he is already doing here on earth. Our job is to watch and listen. And when the call to work comes, we go. It's not always going to be glamorous, and your work may not look like mine, but none of that matters. What matters is your yes. Okay, well, if none of that matters, and if the times the workers got there don't matter, and what matters in this parable? What's the important thing? Well, if you said the landowner, you're right. The landowner himself went out not once, not twice, but 3 times to gather workers. Landowners didn't usually do that, by the way. They had managers and hired men to do that for them. In verse 6, the landowner found the stragglers. Now, that's not a translation choice. The Greek word there is eurisko. And y'all may know the word eureka. I found it. It's the same Greek word. It implies that the leftover workers were intentionally searched for, rather than just seen by happenstance. After the last group was brought into the vineyard at 5, the marketplace would have been cleared. Every worker willing to work would be there at the landowner's vineyard. The landowner had a place for everyone, weak, strong, young, old. And by doing so, he ensured that the daily needs of this unprotected, vulnerable group were met. Finally, the landowner responds with grace to the grumblers. Verse 13 and 14, he says, but he replied to one of them, friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. The landowner doesn't cast them out into the land of weeping and gnashing of teeth. He calls them his friends. They're gently rebuked and sent on their way with their wages paid. And probably a lot to think about. Rather than bring the hammer down, the landowner turned it into a teachable moment. You see, when we focus on the workers and fairness and work and reward, we completely miss this unbelievable grace, kindness, and generosity of the landowner. We serve a God who never stops looking for the stragglers, who humbled himself and came to a place that he didn't need to go in order to bring the lost into belonging. When you think about your story, when you write it down, which is something I highly recommend you do, don't look at it with eyes darting around to everybody else. Don't consider where you came from in the light of what others have been through. Don't compare your story to someone else's. Don't think about how others have treated you. You have to look to the Master. Your whole life, God has been working in you and through you to bring you to him and to do God's work through you. And if you just focus on the work, the reward, or everybody else, you're going to totally miss the best part of your story. Your story is your own. And your story has value. Don't allow comparison and resentment cloud your vision to the incredible grace and generosity that you have received from the one who went out looking for you when you didn't belong, who invited you into his work to accomplish something you and only you could do. A master who doesn't hold up the reward of heaven as a carrot to get us to work, but one who actually wants us to labor along with him. A master who will never stop looking to bring in the stragglers, who will meet the deepest needs of their hearts. We're all the laborers, and we are all precious in his sight. Will you receive the benediction with me? Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created.